Nobody broke down her door. Nobody ransacked her home. Nobody left behind the chaos you would expect from a violent crime. The house was clean. Some rooms were immaculate. And yet, Nancy Guthrie was gone. That contradiction is the engine of this entire case. And 60 days later, it is still driving everything. I am Febry. Welcome to the Febry Report. If you found this video, you already know this case matters. Subscribe right now and stay with me, because what I am about to walk you through goes deeper than anything the daily headlines have covered. Most people came to this case through Savannah Guthrie, the Today Show anchor, the familiar face on morning television. And that is a completely understandable entry point. But to actually understand what happened, you have to start somewhere else entirely. You have to start with the house. Nancy Guthrie had lived in that Tucson, Arizona home since the 1970s, over 50 years in the same property, the same desert neighborhood, the same yard where her children grew up. She was 84 years old. She had serious back pain. Getting to her own mailbox was a difficult trip on a bad day. She was not a woman who wandered. She was not a woman who left without telling anyone. She was a woman rooted, deeply, completely rooted to that specific piece of ground. On the evening of January 31st, she visited her daughter Annie, who lives just a couple of miles away in Tucson. She took an Uber home. The FBI has since obtained footage of Nancy inside that vehicle, what some investigators have described as potentially the last confirmed visual of her alive. A quiet ride, an ordinary night. Nobody in that car had any reason to think it was anything other than a grandmother heading home after visiting her daughter. She arrived. She went inside. At approximately 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, her pacemaker lost its Bluetooth connection to her phone. That signal drop is one of the hardest facts in this case. Digital, time-stamped, impossible to argue with. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie, it happened before 3 a.m. She has not been seen since. When Annie and her husband Tommaso arrived at the house the following morning, the back doors were propped open. Annie's first thought, the thought of a daughter who was not yet ready to accept what she was actually looking at, was that maybe there had been a medical emergency. Maybe an ambulance had come. Maybe their mother was in a hospital somewhere, confused and frightened but alive. She and Savannah, calling from New York City, began phoning local hospitals. No record of Nancy Guthrie, not at any of them. The interior of that house is where the investigation gets strange, and where the most important questions about what actually happened begin to form. A source close to the investigation confirmed to journalists covering this case on the ground in Tucson that there were no visible signs of an assault inside Nancy Guthrie's home, not a minor absence of chaos, an almost deliberate absence. Some rooms were described as immaculate, nothing thrown, nothing broken, nothing suggesting a struggle had taken place anywhere inside those walls. That detail initially confused a lot of people. If someone was taken against her will from her own home in the middle of the night, where is the evidence of resistance? Where is the sign of what happened? The answer, according to a former detective with the Pima County Sheriff's Office who spent decades on the job and who physically walked the property surrounding the house, comes down to one word: control. Whoever entered that house maintained control of the situation from the moment they arrived. They did not come to create disorder. They did not come to terrorize or destroy. They came with a specific objective, a specific plan, and enough operational discipline to execute it without leaving behind the kind of visual chaos that would announce itself immediately to anyone who walked in the next morning. The blood on the front steps tells a different story, and a more human one. Investigators who analyzed the pattern described it as drops falling straight down. No directional movement, no drag, no splatter suggesting a blow struck while someone was running or being pulled. Just vertical drops at the threshold, at the precise point between inside and outside. The former detective's interpretation: Nancy Guthrie may still have been on her feet when she reached that door, being guided out, still moving under her own power, however shakily. And at that last moment, the threshold, the place where the outside world was just a few feet away, she may have made one final attempt to resist. A hard impact, a blow. The blood fell straight down, and then she crossed that threshold, and she was gone. Let me take you around to the back of the property, because that is almost certainly where this operation began, and the details back there are more telling than anything that happened at the front door. The terrain behind Nancy Guthrie's home is not what most people outside Arizona picture when they imagine a residential neighborhood. Thick desert brush, cactus growth covering the ground and climbing the fence lines, power lines overhead, no streetlights anywhere nearby. Investigators who stood back there after dark described it as genuinely, completely dark. The kind of darkness where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face without a light source, where you cannot navigate without already knowing the path. Whoever came for Nancy Guthrie that night knew the path. Reports confirmed by multiple outlets indicate that the alleged abductor used one of Nancy's own flower pots to prop open the back gate of the property. That detail, easy to pass over as a minor logistical note, is actually one of the most behaviorally significant pieces of information that has emerged from this entire case. Think about what it requires. You are in a dark yard. You need to prop open a gate so that it can be accessed again without noise, without forced entry, without leaving marks on the lock or the frame. You choose a flower pot, not a rock from the ground. There are rocks in a desert yard, not a tool you brought from outside. That would be one more object to carry and account for. You choose a flower pot that was already there, already positioned near that gate, already familiar to you. How familiar? Familiar enough to find it in the dark, familiar enough to know it was there at all, familiar enough to have seen it on a prior visit, or multiple prior visits, when you were studying the layout of this property and planning what you were going to do. Forensic criminologist Dr. Laura Petler addressed this exact type of behavioral evidence in her public commentary on the case. Every choice an offender makes at a crime scene is a signature. The choice of one object over another available option tells investigators something about the offender's prior knowledge, prior access, and prior relationship to that location. The flower pot is not a random detail. It is a data point, and it points towards someone who had been in that yard before. 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, someone may have been standing at her front door. That is the implication of the January 11th surveillance timeline, a date that the FBI began specifically asking neighbors about early in the investigation, going door to door requesting any footage from that night, asking whether anyone had noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood. The explanation traces back to the Google Nest camera mounted on Nancy's front door. Google initially indicated to investigators that one of the images captured by that camera, showing a figure near the property, may have been dated January 11th. Google later issued a qualification, saying they could not be fully certain of the exact date. But the image exists, and a figure appears in it, 3 weeks before the abduction. A second date, January 24th, the weekend immediately before Nancy disappeared, also became a focus of investigative canvassing. Investigators were specifically asking neighbors for footage from weekends, which analysts covering the case noted as potentially meaningful. If the person responsible held a conventional job during the week, weekend visits to the neighborhood would be the logical time for reconnaissance. These two dates, taken alongside the operational details of the abduction itself, form a pattern that former law enforcement professionals have been consistent in describing as pre-operational surveillance. Not casual, not coincidental. A deliberate, repeated study of the target, her home, her routines, her neighborhood's blind spots, the timing of when the street went quiet. Former FBI cellular analysis expert Scott Eicher confirmed that geofencing technology, the process of establishing a virtual geographic boundary around a location and identifying every cell phone that entered that boundary during a defined time window, would have been applied to this case from the moment federal investigators gained full access. If any device was present in that neighborhood across multiple dates corresponding to the surveillance timeline, that data exists. It may already be in investigators' hands. Former criminal defense attorney Mark Garagos suggested publicly that the investigative picture may be considerably more advanced than official statements have indicated, that geofencing and cell tower data may have already identified patterns of presence near the property that investigators are using to build a case they are not yet ready to announce. Whether that is true cannot be confirmed. But the silence from the investigation over 60 days is not the same thing as the investigation being silent. There is a detail about Nancy Guthrie's front door that most coverage has walked right past, and it changes the entire theory of how the abduction was carried out. The front door had a security door in front of it, not decorative, a heavy, reinforced barrier with solid bars, the kind that is specifically designed to prevent unauthorized entry from the front of a home. common in Tucson, common in that type of neighborhood. Designed for exactly the situation you would think might be unfolding here, someone trying to force their way in from the front. Except, according to analysis from multiple former law enforcement professionals, that door was almost certainly not forced. It was opened from the inside, which means someone was already inside when the figure visible on the Nest camera footage appeared at the front of the property in the pre-dawn hours of February 1st. News Nation correspondent Brian Enton was among the first to draw public attention to this detail. The security door, intact and locked from the outside, effectively rules out the scenario where a single individual broke in through the front, subdued Nancy inside, and then walked out the same way. The door had to be unlocked from within, which requires someone to have been in there first. The operational picture that emerges from this, in the assessment of the former Pima County detective, involves at minimum 2 people. Almost certainly 3. One individual inside the property, having entered from the back through the propped gate, waiting for Nancy to return home. A second individual positioned at the front, the one visible on the camera, ready to receive her once she was brought to the door. And a third, likely in a vehicle parked well away from the property, positioned to move quickly once Nancy was outside and being transported away from the neighborhood. 3 people, defined roles, coordinated timing, a plan that required knowledge of the property's specific security features, including the front security door, in order to account for them in advance. This was not a crime of impulse. This was architecture. The ransom dimension of this case has been one of the most carefully managed pieces of information, and one of the most emotionally devastating. Savannah Guthrie confirmed in her first on-camera appearance since her mother's disappearance that ransom communications had been received. She was measured. She chose her words carefully. But the weight behind what she was describing was unmistakable. The family had received what she believed to be genuine demands, not the flood of fraudulent attempts that a case of this visibility inevitably generates. Genuine ones. She said clearly, "We will pay." But the communication stopped, or changed, or something shifted in the negotiation dynamic that has never been fully explained publicly. And now, according to reporting from multiple outlets, a new ransom note has surfaced, one containing language that claims Nancy Guthrie has gone to be with God. The authenticity of this communication has not been confirmed by law enforcement. Official sources have not publicly addressed it, and in a case that has attracted fraudulent ransom attempts since nearly the first days, the possibility that this is another fabrication is real and must be stated clearly. But the language itself is worth examining analytically. It is not a demand, it is not a threat. It does not ask for anything or offer anything. It makes a declaration, past tense, final, closing the door on negotiation without explicitly confirming what happened. Criminologists who study kidnapping and extortion cases note that this type of communication can serve a specific psychological purpose: to cause the victim's family to stop generating public pressure, stop advocating loudly, retreat into grief and away from the spotlight that makes perpetrators nervous. Make them believe it is over. Make them go quiet. Whether that is what this note represents, a manipulation, or whether it reflects something darker about Nancy Guthrie's actual fate, no one outside the investigation can say with certainty. What can be said is that Savannah Guthrie, in her interview, stated clearly that the investigation was still ongoing, that her mother could still be alive. She was not speaking from denial. She was speaking from the position of someone who has seen information that the public has not. Hold that. The contractors. This is one of the investigative threads that received significant attention from forensic experts and law enforcement analysts, and it is worth understanding in detail because it represents a category of suspect that most kidnapping investigations do not have to seriously consider. In the weeks leading up to February 1st, multiple contractors with legitimate work orders had access to the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home. An electrician working on an electrical panel replacement, a job significant enough to require multiple days on site. HVAC technicians performing service maintenance. Reports also indicated roofers had been working on the property. These are individuals who, in the course of doing entirely legitimate work, would have gained direct knowledge of the home's interior layout, the rooms, the access points, the back door and its condition, whether it locked properly, whether it was typically left open, the position of the cameras, the schedule of the resident. Investigators have been systematically tracking down every individual connected to those work orders. DNA collection, buccal swabs from the inside of the cheek, non-invasive and highly accurate, is standard procedure. Compare those profiles against any biological material recovered from the scene. Either they match something or they do not. Either way, you are eliminating possibilities or building toward a confirmation. Forensic DNA analyst Savannah Ryan, with more than 25 years of laboratory experience, made a point worth dwelling on. She described DNA shedding as constant and involuntary. Every person leaves biological material wherever they go, on every surface they touch, with every word they speak in an enclosed space. The steering wheel of the vehicle used to transport Nancy Guthrie, the back gate, the flower pot, the door frame, the floor near the threshold where her blood fell. Every one of those surfaces is a potential repository for the perpetrator's genetic identity. The science does not care how careful they were. It does not forgive time, and it does not care how long ago something happened. If usable DNA was collected and entered into the right databases, this case has a forensic pathway to resolution that exists independently of any witness coming forward. That pathway is slow. It is methodical. It does not generate press releases, but it has broken cases that looked far colder than this one. The crime scene handling in the first hours after Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was reported has become one of the sharpest points of criticism from forensic professionals. And understanding why it matters requires understanding what evidence was potentially lost in those early hours. Forensic professor Joe Scott Morgan was direct in his public assessment. The scene was not properly secured. People walked through. The front doormat, directly in the path of the suspect visible on the Nest camera footage, potentially containing blood deposition and shoe tread impressions, was not collected in the initial sweep. The interior threshold area, where blood may have been tracked inside, was not immediately treated as a primary evidence zone. There is a technique called electrostatic imaging. It uses electromagnetic fields to lift footprint impressions from dust on hard surfaces, impressions that are completely invisible to the naked eye but scientifically recoverable under the right conditions. The technique can reveal shoe size, tread pattern, weight distribution, gait. It can potentially match a specific impression to a specific shoe belonging to a specific person. Once people walk through a scene, even with protective coverings, that evidence is gone. Permanently. It cannot be recovered after the fact regardless of how sophisticated the laboratory is. Former prosecutor Nancy Grace described the early crime scene management as a fundamental failure, one with consequences that will follow this case all the way into a courtroom whenever that day arrives. Defense attorneys do not need to prove innocence. They need to plant doubt. And a compromised crime scene, managed carelessly in its critical first hours, is exactly the kind of doubt that can unravel a prosecution that took years to build. The investigators in the field, the ones collecting swabs, reviewing footage, processing tips day after day, are doing work that deserves respect. The failure was at the leadership level, at the decision-making level, at the level where someone should have looked at that front porch, at that doormat, at that threshold, and said, "Nobody touches anything until forensics has documented every square inch." That decision, made or not made in the first hours of February 1st, may carry consequences this case has not finished paying for. Savannah Guthrie went back to work. She sat across from her co-anchor on the Today Show on camera, in front of millions of viewers who had watched this case unfold for 2 months, and she told the truth about what she was living. She was not polished about it. She was not managed. There was no publicist's careful framing around what she said or how she looked saying it. She looked like a daughter, exhausted, raw, carrying something that had no shape and no name because it was still happening, still unresolved, still refusing to become the past. She talked about the morning her mother was discovered missing. She described calling hospitals from New York City, still reaching for the explanation where everything was okay, where this was a medical scare and not what it actually was. She talked about her mother's back pain, the difficulty walking to the mailbox, the frailty that an 84-year-old body carries, and the fury and helplessness of knowing that someone had looked at all of that vulnerability and decided to exploit it. And then she said the thing that stopped people. She looked into the camera and she apologized to her mother. "Mommy, I'm sorry." Because some part of her, the part that grief breaks open and makes irrational, believed that her own career, her own visibility, her own success had made her mother a target. Her brother Cameron, the one shaped by years of military intelligence work, confirmed it plainly when she asked him, "Yes, probably. That was likely a factor. not said cruelly, said the way someone trained to assess situations says things, with precision, without cushioning, and that landed on Savannah like a physical blow. Nancy Grace, watching that interview, described something that I want to sit with for a moment. She said it took her back to her own worst moment, the night she learned her fiancé Keith had been murdered when she was 19 years old. The feeling of sitting in the dark with words that were not built to carry what you were feeling. The feeling of wanting to go somewhere nobody could see you and make a sound that had no language in it. Just the animal acknowledgement of an unbearable thing. That is what Savannah Guthrie was doing on national television. Not performing grief, living it in public, because she believed, and she was right, that keeping the pressure on this case was worth the cost of whatever it took out of her. There is a dimension to this case that does not get covered nearly enough in the day-to-day reporting, and it is the one that connects Nancy Guthrie's family to thousands of other families across this country who have never had a television anchor for a daughter, never had $1 million reward, never had weeks of national news coverage fighting for them. Ambiguous loss. It is the term grief researchers use for the experience of losing someone without knowing what happened to them. No confirmed death, no body, no clear endpoint to the story, just absence. And the psychological torture of not being able to begin processing that absence because the brain refuses to file away something that might still change. Mental health professionals who have spoken publicly in the context of this case describe it as one of the most destructive forms of grief a person can experience, not because the pain is necessarily greater than confirmed loss, but because it cannot move. It has nowhere to go. The brain keeps the loop open, keeps searching for the answer that has not come, keeps waking you up at 3 a.m. with scenarios you have already run 1,000 times, finding new angles, refusing to let you rest. The Guthrie family described it in their public statement in language that every family who has ever had a loved one vanish will recognize immediately. We cannot grieve. We can only ache and wonder. News Nation spoke directly with families of long-term missing persons in the context of this case. The response from all of them was not resentment about the attention this particular disappearance received. It was recognition. A painful, immediate recognition of the experience Savannah was describing publicly, and a fragile hope that a case this visible, covered this extensively, might cause someone somewhere to look again at a file that had been sitting in a drawer for years. That hope deserves to be honored. Not just in the Nancy Guthrie case, but in every case, every family, every missing person who deserves the same weight of investigative resources regardless of who their daughter is. Let me tell you where the investigation actually stands right now, pulling every thread together into the clearest picture the available evidence supports. The surveillance operation began at least 3 weeks before the abduction, possibly longer. Dates in early and mid-January correspond to a pattern of presence near Nancy Guthrie's home that investigators have been specifically asking neighbors to help document. The individual or individuals responsible studied the property, studied the neighborhood, identified the camera positions, the access points, the lighting conditions, and the routine of an 84-year-old woman who lived alone. The operation itself involved multiple people, one inside the property, having entered through the back before Nancy returned home from Annie's house, one at the front visible on the Nest camera footage waiting, one almost certainly in a vehicle parked well away from the house, out of any camera's frame, ready to move. There was no forced entry anywhere on the property. The back gate was propped open using Nancy's own flower pot. The front security door was opened from the inside. The interior of the home was left in orderly condition, the only physical evidence of what happened, the only trace of the violence of that night, was the blood at the front threshold where Nancy Guthrie may have made her final attempt to resist. The forensic pathways still open. DNA from biological material collected at the scene, potentially matchable through genealogical databases, geofencing and cell tower data that may already identify devices present in the neighborhood across multiple surveillance dates. Contractor work orders connecting known individuals to the interior of the home in the weeks before the abduction, vehicle surveillance footage from commercial locations within 2 miles of the property, and the reward, over $1 million, available to anyone, anonymous, no arrest required, no conviction required. The investigation is scaled back in terms of active personnel, but it is not closed. The FBI remains involved. The forensic processing continues. And somewhere in this country, the person or people responsible are living with the knowledge of what they did, and with the awareness that the net, even when it moves slowly, does eventually close. Nancy Guthrie was not a woman of power or immense wealth. She was an 84-year-old living a quiet life in Tucson. Yet, someone looked at her and saw a means to an end. The chilling reality of this case lies in its calculated deliberateness. This wasn't a crime of impulse. Perpetrators spent weeks mapping her property, noting her unlocked doors, and timing her routines, all because she was the mother of someone famous. That level of operational patience, staying silent for 60 days in an era of geofencing and DNA, suggests either skill or immense luck. But luck eventually runs out. DNA is permanent, cell data is objective, and a $1 reward is a powerful wedge. The moment one person values that life-changing sum over loyalty or fear, the silence ends for everyone involved. Savannah Guthrie should never have had to apologize on national television for her own success. The weight she carries belongs to the people who targeted her mother. We do not move on, and we do not forget. If this perspective reached you, share this video. One share could reach the person holding the key to this case. I am Febry. This is the Febry Report, and we will continue to push for answers.